All right. For all of you who are used to a different class on Sunday mornings, I apologize in advance. Apparently, I'm the one who has so little life that I'm not gone on spring break. So here we are. Those of us who didn't get to go anywhere for spring break, and you know, who'd have thought last weekend of the spring break we get a hard freeze? Welcome to Oklahoma. Last week we timed out what take me down just a little bit. Last week we timed out right at the last slide. We probably won't today. I keep learning my lesson. Last week was 30 slides, this week it's 34. So, but this is one of them, so don't panic. To get into chapter 3, which is where we're supposed to be today, we need to build a little bit of a bridge. And so I'm going to start us back at the next to the last section of chapter 2 to give you context just real quick. And then we'll get that last section of chapter 2, which is where we ended last week. We'll pick up there and see how far we get in chapter 3. I doubt we're going to get caught up today. You ever have one of those mornings where everything seems to need to be done in a hurry? I'm sure has nothing to do with March Madness and the fact that I probably watched too much basketball yesterday instead of building slides. And so if you saw me in the sound booth this morning, I was building the last slides of chapter 3 this morning. And I've had enough tea that I'm kind of wired up. So if we get flying, just mas despacio, por favor. Just let me know to slow down. So chapter 2, we're going to start with the reality of where folks were in the church at Rome when Paul was writing. For all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law. And all who have sinned under law will be judged by the law. Now, is anybody left out here? You're either under the law or you're not. And you're going to be judged whether you're under the law or not. It's just a function of what it is that's going to be the standard by which you are judged. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but those who do it. Those are the ones that are justified. Now remember that what we've got going on in Rome is not unlike what's going on in a lot of other places. You've got Jewish Christians in the church at Rome who want to bind upon the non-Jewish Christians, the Gentile Christians, some form of the law, some piece or set of pieces of the law. They just can't get their mind wrapped around the idea that you can have an appropriate relationship with God without some type of code. They want some type of rules. And so what rules do they know? The rules they know are the Mosaic Law, and so they're trying to bind some of those onto the non-Jewish Christians. With that principle in mind, and that's kind of one of the underpinning themes of the letter, I want you to think about the Jews in the Roman church comparable to members of the church today. And I want you to watch for certain traps. I hope that I will point them out along the way that we may tend to fall into because of our relationship both to our brothers and sisters inside the church and also to the unchurched. I think there's a parallel here, and it's one of the more important, I think, applications of what Paul is writing. So we touched on this right at the end last week. Two types of sinners here. There are those who aim and miss, and those who see the rule and step across it on purpose. and intentional sinning versus I'm trying the best I can, but I keep falling short. Two types in view here. The result is the same. It still results in a separation from God, and that is what the Scripture will refer to as death, the second death, a separation from God. So sin separates us from God, whether it is that we see a rule and we step across it intentionally, or we see the rule and we're doing our best to get there, but we just can't quite get there. We miss the mark. The result for both is the same. And remember that Paul speaks to the Gentiles here about the law that binds them. The part of the evidence of a creator having created us is an inherent right that's kind of built into us, a conscience that's built into us that has a set of rules. And Paul is speaking to this group of Gentile Christians at Rome who would be tasked by their own conscience. So if there are rules in a natural moral order that are written on our hearts, and there are, and I said last week, and I recognize that you can find true sociopaths among humankind where that conscience is bent a different direction, but we have an inherent sense of right and wrong written in our hearts. Apart from the Mosaic law, we have that. And Paul's speaking to that here to the Gentile Christians who were without the law and saying to them, sometimes you have obeyed the law without having the law. And the way they've done that, or the reason that's bound upon them, is inherent in their hearts were right and wrong concepts. And if they are intentionally violating their own conscience, it's the same as if you're the hamartolos that we saw on the last slide, stepping across the line on purpose. But that law is a law unto the Gentiles as well. So if you look at James 4:17, that point is driven home there. He who knows what to do and does it not, it is sin to him. My paraphrase. So a principle that if you understand right from wrong in your own conscience and you violate your conscience, either intentionally or because you're unable to hit the mark, you are in the same boat as the Jews were under the law when they could not live up to the law. And we got a little bit of this last week, so I'm going to just zoom through it so we can hopefully make good progress today. Okay, so what is the result of everyone's relationship to God, whether your conscience or the Mosaic law? How many of us are hitting the mark? 0. In the end of chapter 2, remember what we've set up as we've juxtaposed the Jews under the law, the Gentiles not under the law, but that everyone falls short and needs a Savior. I mean, that is that's the condition set in the letter that Paul, starting in chapter 3, will devise the solution for. So 17 through 29 is a continuation of a rhetorical diatribe that is a pointed attack on the Jews in the church at Rome by comparing them against the Gentiles in the church at Rome. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God and know His will and approve what is excellent because you are instructed from the law, and if you're sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? All right, what's going on here? What's the problem in Rome that he's pointing out? Not only do they not follow it, but what are they doing with the law? They're judging others against the law who did not have the law. Right? Okay, so it is attempting to bind upon those without the law, the Mosaic law. If you presuppose or presume to do that, why do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? While you say that you must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? A reference to going into pagan temples and prying the jewels out of the idols there. You who boast in the law dishonor God by breaking the law. For it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Now that's a quote from Isaiah, and we're going to dissect that in a minute. But let's take this passage and break it down into maybe 3 or 4 pieces. You call yourself a Jew and you rely on the law. If you're sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, now you call yourself a Jew and you rely on the law, and then you put yourself in the position of teacher. What does the scripture tell us about teachers? Judged more harshly. Makes me feel really good to be up in front of you this morning, just so we're all clear here. I'm a sinner. More on that in a minute. When you teach others, what are you teaching? Do you do the same things that you're teaching against? Here, he has a couple of examples. Do you steal when you're teaching don't steal? Do you commit adultery when you say don't commit adultery? I was having a conversation with a couple of folks after class last week. And, we all have our foibles. We all have those things that are our particular challenges. And I asked the group standing there, can you find a man who can live up to the standard, he who looks upon another woman with lust in his heart has committed adultery with her? Can you watch the basketball tournament and watch the commercials and not get an opportunity to lust? The fact is, in our culture, and in any culture really, sex sells. And so Madison Avenue makes sure it's in front of you all the time. If the television's on, if you're driving down the road looking at billboards, whatever it is. Advertising appeals to our lowest common denominator, the animal in each of us. And so here is a standard I can't hit. I would suggest to you, here is a standard, my wife tells me regularly, here is a standard no man can hit. So who presumes to stand before you as a teacher to bind upon you that which we cannot do? Because that's what the Jews were doing. The Jews were binding on the church at Rome rules they could not live up to. What do we call that? We call it hypocrisy. The Greek word meaning the mask. We all put this good mask on up front. It's hard to say what's going on behind the eyes, right? The name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Now this is one of those passages that just puts me in fear. And it quotes Isaiah 52:5. And there's a little bit, there's actually about 4 Old Testament references to this concept. And we don't have time to put all 4 of them here and dissect all 4 of them. So we're going to go to the closest of the quotations and see if we can build in here what Principal Paul's looking for. And let's look at I gave you the context, but let's look specifically at 52:5. Now therefore, what have I here, declares the Lord? seeing that my people are taken away for nothing. Their rulers wail, declares the Lord, and continually all day my name is despised. Therefore my people shall know my name. Therefore in that day they shall know that it is I who speak. Here I am. Now the context here is Isaiah speaking to the idea of God's people being taken away into captivity. And by their having been taken away into captivity, it decries the idea that they are in fact God's chosen people. If you're God's chosen people, why has God allowed you to be taken away into captivity? If you're the elect, why is it that God has not protected you from those conquering nations? Okay? It's a little bit difficult to get to where I want to get here, but it is a statement that if God's so great and you're His, why is it that bad stuff is happening to you? And so when the whole world is looking at what's happening with God's people being taken into captivity, it questions the power of God. Make sense? Okay, so that's what Paul's trying to get to here, is that the Judaizers in Rome, trying to bind on the Gentile Christians at Rome this sense of the law, are stuck with the idea that if the law is so good and the law is capable of salvation, why is it that you can't keep it? And in fact, because you can't keep it, it questions whether or not there's a relationship between you and God in the first place. Okay, so just a few points here. If you read through the Mosaic Law, you get this sense of outward manifestations, the outward requirements. It's 600 plus rules that the Jews were supposed to live by. We think in terms, or at least when we first read it, I think we think in terms of these outward manifestations. We're going to follow the rules. All of that is external. And if we're following all of those rules externally, then we're righteous. Because we follow all the rules, we're righteous. But it's based on our obedience to the law. If we're putting ourselves in their shoes, our obedience to the law is based upon an internal state of mind, an internal condition of the heart. So if to empower that saving feature, we have to have both the internal condition of the heart and the external manifestation of following the law. It's the combination of those two things that empowers us to salvation. Everybody with me? So it's not just you got to keep the rules. You have to have the right condition of the heart keeping the rules. That's what was intended by the law.
It doesn't really matter if you keep the rules and you really want to break them.
Yes. Carol says it doesn't matter if you're keeping the rules if what you really want is you want to break them. Right? So we know that by the first century that the law had become all about the letter and not about the substance. The Pharisees were all about keeping the letter of the law without regard to the weightier matters it's referred to, without regard to what underpins the law, and that's the condition of the heart. So Paul's point being that there has to be a link between a heart conditioned to have a relationship to God and an outward action that is obedient to the law. And then he says, those of you who are teaching, watch out. If you think that your adherence to the law is going to save you, perhaps, but having it, academically understanding it, having done the academic lift studying the law, to have a thorough knowledge of the law, the possession of that knowledge is insufficient to salvation. The possession of the knowledge plus obedience is insufficient to salvation. It's possession of the law, obedience to the law, and a heart minded to a relationship with God that results in your obedience to the law that it takes to get to salvation. And those are 3 steps that certainly by this point was impossible for that Jewish community to do. Truth be known, impossible for every one of us to do. So the outward manifestation of the truth is of no value without the underpinning faith that is the theme of the letter. Okay, this is all about Paul saying to those Jews at the church in Rome, you can try to bind those elements of the law on the Gentile Christians if you want to, but it will only show you to be hypocrites because you cannot keep the law. Now remember my challenge at the beginning. Think about where we are as Christians today in our interaction with our brothers and sisters inside the church, and certainly our interaction with the unchurched. It's not just their hypocrisy, but it's ours. If our resort is to legalism, then where is our credibility with the unchurched when they see us violating the rules? We take ourselves real seriously. It's real easy sitting in this room, having just worshiped. It's real easy for us to think about we're here, we're singing, we're praying, we're engaged, we're plugged in, we're hooked up. Our hearts are in the right place. We're doing all of those things right. It's real easy for us to begin to believe that it's about us. And it's not. It's about Him. And it's about His Son. It's about the gospel. Here's why this is pretty sobering. For it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. We presume to teach the oracles of God. Do we do it with clean hands? And we talked a little bit early last week in the lesson about the clean hands doctrine. Do we teach having obeyed? Do we think we're better than others because we're in the church? We may be presenting those outward manifestations, and I can tell you that I know we're all trying. We should be all trying. I can tell you that I'm trying, but it doesn't always happen. I can tell you that when I'm under stress and when it gets to, my bucket gets right there to the lip and it's about to pour over and the next drop hits, that some of it pours over. And it can be pretty ugly. And I'm trying to be an example, right? Isn't that what we're all trying to do? Aren't we trying to be an example to those around us? Perhaps to our brothers and sisters for encouragement, perhaps to the unchurched, to give them a reason to ask us why we have hope. Peter talks about that. And yet, I fall short. And sometimes it's in very public ways where people see it happen. And what do they think when they see that happen? Do we possess that circumcision of the heart? I'll stay on this slide for just a second. What do they, when that happens, when I publicly fall short. Something lands on my desk that I wasn't expecting. I'm already up to here. It lands on my desk and blah, 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 blah. I'll tell you the best example of it. It embarrasses me to death, but it was on the golf course. And I know a lot of you guys play golf and are good at it. I used to try, and I'm not. And I had a guy we had been studying with on the golf course with me. And the third hole at the golf course in Poto, the tee shot was really narrow. It was a dogleg right. And the tee shot was super narrow, trees on both sides, a tough tee shot. And I hit the best tee shot on that hole I'd ever hit. Perfect. Right out there, right in the middle, right at the dog leg. I'm going to have a short iron into the green. I was pumped up. Square off on that shot. The guy standing across the fairway from me, from Charlie, from me to you. And I visualized it, man. I'm going to birdie this hole. Finally, I'm going to have a birdie in my golf career. And I top the ball, and it goes about 8 feet. And I cussed a blue streak. That's why I quit playing golf. One of the many reasons. People got hurt when I played golf, so that was another reason. So the blue cloud is hanging in the air, and the guy I've been studying with says, that's a real Christian approach. That 2x4 is still sticking in my head. It was a long time ago. Wish I could say it doesn't still happen occasionally. When that happens, where are we? Are we acting in such a way that people will cut us a break? Or are we acting in such a way that we are better? Are we acting in such a way that people are afraid to be around us because they can't live up to the standard that we're putting out? Are we taking ourselves so seriously about the standard that we're putting out that we won't acknowledge that sometimes we embarrass ourselves pretty badly? I'm a sinner. I would ask for a show of hands. We all are. We are all desperately in need of a Savior. So there are two, what I will call coexistent and parallel expectations. And these are God's expectations of us. Scripture in a number of places, and here's a short list, tells us that we're supposed to be making an effort to live an external life that conforms to the teaching of Christ. So when people see us, they see that we're different. We are indeed called out. We are indeed the ecclesia. People should see us and see something different than the world. That was the Jews in the law, by the way. Why the Sabbath? Why a day during the week no one could work? I mean, they lived in a time where if you didn't work 7 days a week, you might not eat. To take a day off was different. All kinds of rules in the law stand out as something different. This a short list of instances in the New Testament where it says, make every effort to conform your life. Make every effort to live out your salvation. In addition to externalizing the teachings of Christ, the individual Christians should align their thinking with that of God. Now that is an internal surrender to the Spirit and letting the Spirit guide us. How about those fruits of the Spirit? How about the fruit of the Spirit? How many of those do people see us living out? Are we internalizing those? Are we, if we're looking at ourselves in the mirror, are we looking like the description that we get in Galatians 5? Are we working out that salvation? Philippians 2, that passage that I come back to again and again, that says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. I love that passage because the word work, there's two different Greek words. The first one being work out from a mold. You're pressed into a shape. Be honest to that shape. That's not effort. That's self-discipline. Be honest to where the Spirit has put you. And then it is God who works, energia. That's the effort. Not my effort. As long as I'll be pressed into the shape, God will make the effort. God will provide the energy. God will make sure that if I am in the mold, that my salvation will show. It's not about my effort, it's about God working through me. I find tremendous comfort in that because I don't have any energy left. Right? The older I get, the less I have. Anybody identify? I need his power, not mine, so that I can conform. If we have faith in the promises, if we, and I said last week, pray for deeper faith, because the deeper that faith, and God's giving us that faith, the deeper that faith, the more deep-seated in your soul the belief in the gospel is, the more you will externalize the belief. And the unfortunate thing is the converse is true. If your faith is shallow, if you have not internalized what Christ has done for you, then maybe your external life doesn't look like it should. There's your self-examination. Do I believe deeply enough in the promises that my automatic reaction is the teaching of Christ? Now that's an ideal with an L on the end of it, because none of us are going to get there. But that's the standard to be striving for. Where am I in my belief in the gospel? To what extent have I internalized the truth of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection to reconcile me to the Father so that I can live eternally? Where is that belief in my structure? Is it 10 miles wide and an inch deep? If so, it's not going to take much for me to let go of it. But if it is miles deep in my soul, then all of this other external stuff should be taking care of itself. And so when I assess my behavior, I'm assessing the depth of my belief in the promises. Because as I deepen my faith, as I deepen my knowledge of the promises, as I internalize the truth of the gospel, then all of that happens. The fruit of the Spirit happens because I believe. Remember, the theme of the letter is that belief is the key. The name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of me. Is how that reads. When Mark looked across the fairway and said to me, "Oh, that's a great Christian approach," how deep was my faith? And what did I do to his when I did that? We're trying to teach by example. What's our example really doing to those around us? Is it drawing people to Christ? Or is it causing them to say, "Oh, and he claims to be a Christian"? That's an indictment. It's a warning. And so what we got about, Thomas, about 4 or 5 minutes? And I'm finally to chapter 3. So chapter 3, given that context, okay? So chapter 1 left us 8 minutes. So chapter 1 leaves us in the pit of pagan Rome. Chapter 2 leaves us not in a much better place, in the pit of self-righteous Judaizers in the church at Rome, who looked down upon the Gentile Christians because they didn't have the law. Right? So we're still not in a very good place. Bear with me. When we get to the end of chapter 3, this thing takes off. But until we get there, it can be pretty dismal. So, chapter 3. I'm dividing chapter 3 into 4 sections. Number 1 is a shift in the rhetorical method that Paul's using in the letter. He shifts from the diatribe to a Socratic dialogue. We'll talk about what that is in a minute. Down at verse 10 through 20, he engages in a testimonia. Uses a method of the Jews against them, if you will, at that point. Verses 21 through 26 are pretty much the heart of the letter itself. The most important piece of the teaching is framed in those 4 or 5 verses. And we'll spend a little bit of time there, but we're going to keep coming back there again and again and again, because that really is the heart of the letter. And then 27 through 31, which we won't get to today, obviously, is where we finally start to be able to breathe a little bit in terms of where we are and where the world is and where our relationship is to God and the world's relationship to God is. And that 27 through 31, that good news really is completely dependent upon what happens at the heart of the letter. So, let's talk a little bit, maybe 5 minutes worth, on the Socratic dialogue that begins chapter 3. So, Paul has engaged up to this point in a diatribe, specific, hard-nosed attack. I don't think anybody can read chapter 1 and not get a specific, hard-nosed attack. People who do these things deserve to die. I don't know how you get more hard-nosed than that attack. So speaking to the idolatry and the sin to which they had been given over because of the idolatry, we know those things result in separation from God, as well they should. That's kind of his attack in chapter 1. His attack in chapter 2, still in a diatribe, is you hypocrites. Think Matthew chapter 23. I mean, it is you hypocrites. You bind these things on these people that you can't do. It sounds a lot like Jesus in Matthew chapter 23. That's chapters 1 and 2. He shifts gears in chapter 3 to begin to ask questions. And he takes on specific critics and specific attacks he is receiving from them in the first portion of chapter 3. And next week we're going to break down 3, maybe 4 of those specific attacks and how he comes back at them. This is a little bit ahead of the curve, but Paul is teaching almost said faithless. That's exactly the opposite of what he's teaching. He's teaching a lawless faith which leads to salvation. Now think about the audience that's hearing this. 2 different groups. One of whom, when they hear lawless faith, is going to think blasphemy immediately and intentionally, intensively, and think deserving of death. You can't possibly have a relationship with God without the law. It has to have rules somehow. There's got to be some moral code involved in this relationship. We'll get to that late chapter 3 and into chapter 4. So he's really arguing to them that there is this lawless faith that will save you. And it's anathema to the Jews. Not something that they're willing to really entertain. How can you have that relationship with God that leads to salvation without some kind of moral code? And of course we don't, but we'll get to that. They still felt this superiority to the Gentiles. They were the chosen, right? They were the children of the promise. They had what they needed. And it was that status that they believed made them better than everybody else. And of course, Paul says that's not the case at all. It may give you some advantage to have had the law because it pointed you toward righteousness. What it really did is it told you how unrighteous you really were. And that's an advantage that maybe the Gentiles didn't have. But that advantage, because of your inability to fulfill the law, that advantage becomes your downfall. Now remember, we fit in the role of the Jews here. There is a prideful obedience, and it's a terrible trap. Look how good I am because I'm here every time the doors are open. You know that checklist exercise of religion we've talked about? I study my Bible every day. I never say a bad word. Let's start checking the boxes of the things we accomplish and act like that means something. The attack here is just as much on us as it is, if that's our mindset, as it is on those Jews that had that mindset in the church at Rome. If you get a sense of superiority because you're of the body, watch out. Satan knows that we're a prideful lot. Satan knows that he can get us by making us think that way because it causes blasphemy. It causes others to look and go, must not be a big deal or he'd be better. The law became inoperative to salvation because of an inability to fulfill it. If our approach to our faith is that we can somehow fulfill the moral code, watch out because your faith becomes no longer operative. Sober place to stop. But Thomas rang the bell. It's all his fault. Next week, we're going to dig this a little bit. We're going to look at specific instances of the attacks and what he's doing to repel the attacks. And then we're going to get into what is the true heart and good news of the letter. And I promise you, we're going to get that next week because I'm only about 2/3 of a chapter behind now, and I got to get caught up. See you next week.